The beggar comes to town. The suitors were worried. The young prince had outwitted them, and the queen had accused them of his attempted murder. They laughed off her accusation as the ravings of a troubled mind, but they were alarmed by the turn of events that had taken. Now they sat uneasily in the great hall of the palace, pondering their next move. "I'm all up for finding the boy and finishing the job off right," said Antonius, "as long as he's alive, but we'll never get our way." "But we should choose our time carefully," said Eumachius. "We should make it look like an accident. There's no need to kill him in broad daylight. For the moment, let's just wait and see." The other suitors murmured their assent. There were a few, like Amphimenius, who felt that they were doing what they were doing was wrong, but they were powerless to oppose Antonius and Eumachius. These two ruthless men had become the suitors' spokesmen and leader. They basically ran the palace. After 3 years in Ithaca, most of the suitors had abandoned any ambitions to marry Penelope themselves, and were content to enjoy themselves as privileged followers of the hangers-on. Hardly had they agreed to postpone his murder when Telemachus himself entered the hall. A hush fell over the suitors as they watched the young prince approach. His face was pale as death, and his voice trembled with anger and contempt. "Is it such a shock, then, to see me back in my own house, or were you expecting to see my ghost?" "Dear Telemachus," said Eumachius, in honeyed tones, "I can't tell you what a relief it is to see you again. We were afraid that you were lost on the high seas like your father." "Telemachus, welcome home," said Antonius, stepping forward to place a hand on the young prince's shoulder. "And now that you're back, let me offer you some fatherly advice. After all, I hope to be your father soon. Your lovely mother's been ill with worry since you went away. We've done everything in our power to comfort her, but she still fears the worst. Go to her. Ask her to forgive you for all your troubles you've caused." Telemachus angrily shook off the treacherous suitor's hand. He walked out of the hall without a word and climbed the stairs to Penelope's lonely room. He found his mother lying on her bed, weeping for her long-lost husband at the bleak future that stared in her face. When she saw her son, she leaped up and embraced him. It was a long time before either of them spoke. Then, when Penelope grew calm, they sat on the edge of her bed, and Telemachus told her about his journey. She questioned him closely, and he kept nothing back, except the most important news of all. He longed to tell her that Odysseus was already in Ithaca, less than 1 day's walk from the palace, but he had sworn to keep quiet. She would know soon enough. In fact, even now, as mother and son were talking, Odysseus stood outside the palace gates. He and Eumaeus had set off from the swineherd's cottage the same morning, and he already had a taste of what lay in store for him. Not far from the city they had encountered Malithenius, the royal goatherd, driving a dozen of his best goats to the palace to please the greedy suitors. Malithenius considered the swineherd his rival and resented his loyalty to Odysseus. He himself had sided with the suitors from the start. Seeing Eumaeus in the company of a miserable beggar, the goatherd laughed out loud. "Well, you two are well matched, I must say. I hope you're not taking your new friend to the palace, Eumaeus. The suitors don't care for mangy dogs. They treat them like this." And Malithenius kicked Odysseus hard in the side as he passed him. Odysseus winced and stumbled. His first impulse was to punish the arrogant goatherd there and then. Instead, like a real old beggar, he shrunk away from his attacker and stared at the ground. Eumaeus was white with fury. "You might laugh now, Malithenius, and strut about like a suitor, or while your herds are steadily eaten away. But I promise you this, you'll dance to a different tune when Odysseus returns." Malithenius laughed even louder. "You too, Eumaeus, you're like an old dog that's lost its master. Don't you understand? Odysseus will never come back. Either he's 6 feet under in some unknown land, or keeping company with the flat fish at the bottom of the sea. And a good thing, too, if you ask me. I like the suitors, and they like me. The trouble with you is that you're stuck in your ways and too proud to make yourself useful. So while I sit among the lords and princes, you go around with a flea-ridden old beggar." Malithenius swaggered on ahead, while Odysseus bit his lip and watched him go. Eumaeus sighed and shook his head. The two men walked on in silence, each of them deep in thought. Before long they entered the city, and soon the palace itself came into view. Odysseus stood before the palace gates and gazed in wonder at his home. On the outside, at least, nothing had changed. A soft whine caught his attention, and he looked down to see an ancient hunting dog that lay wheezing in the shade of the steaming dunghill beside the gates. The dog was half starved and covered in sores, but Odysseus could tell that it had once been a fine animal. It stared up at him, twitching its ears and feebly wagging its tail. Suddenly, in its ruined features, he recognized Argos, his favorite dog that he had raised himself from a tiny puppy all those years before. He knelt down and gently patted its head, forcing back the tears so that Eumaeus could not see. "Come, old friend," said Eumaeus, "the young prince has asked me to bring you to the palace, and here we are. Leave that poor creature and follow me. And I warn you, be prepared for some rough treatment. Like most cowards who hunt in packs, these precious suitors are cruel men." The swineherd led the way through the gates toward the great hall, and the old beggar hobbled close behind him. Neither of them looked back to see the old dog take its last breath, happy to die now that it had seen Odysseus again. Inside the great hall, Odysseus was shocked by the scene that met his eyes. Men lay around everywhere, gorging themselves on roasted meat and swilling back strong red wine. The air was full of raucous shouts and drunken laughter. Some of Penelope's maids sat with the men, giggling at crude jokes and flirting openly. At the far end of the hall, set apart from the rest, Telemachus shared a table with a few trusted friends. Ancient Holofernes, Pyrrhus, Mendon, the page, and Phemius, the bard. The young prince called Eumaeus over while Odysseus in his beggar's disguise sat just inside the threshold and waited. Soon Eumaeus returned with the bread and meat from the young prince's table. Odysseus chewed his food slowly, considering his next move. Setting his meal aside, he stepped out of the shadows and moved among the suitors with an outstretched hand. Most of them ignored him, but Antonius jumped up angrily at his approach. "Insolent swineherd," he hissed, turning to Eumaeus. "How dare you bring a vermin-infested creature like this into our midst? You complain often enough that we devour your young master's inheritance. Do you expect us to share it with this dirty old beggar? Get this wretch out of here before I drag him and throw him to the dogs." The other suitors roared in approval. It would be good sport to order the dogs to attack the old beggar, even though he wouldn't last long. But when Telemachus stood up to face Antonius, they fell silent. The young prince's face was gloomy, and his voice was cold with anger. "Antonius, aren't you satisfied to live at my expense? Would you instruct me how to live as well? Leave the old man alone, or you'll pay for your cruelty." Antonius was too astonished to reply. Telemachus had never dared speak out like this. Odysseus seized the chance to provoke him further. "Come then, noble lord," he said, stretching out his hand again. "Will you not give me something now? Or are you too mean to spare the crumbs from another man's table?" "Old fool," answered Antonius, "I'll give you something all right, to repay your insults as they deserve." He grabbed a footrest and hurled it at Odysseus, hitting him straight in the chest with a deafening thud. The old beggar staggered back and almost fell. Without another glance at Antonius, he shook his head sadly and walked back to his palace by the main doors. Fierce anger surged up in his back son's heart, but he wisely bit his lip and held back his hand. It was not time yet. The hall fell strangely quiet. The old beggar had upset the party, and no one knew just what to make of it. However, it was not long before something happened that made everyone forget the incident. A well-known Ithacan beggar named Iris, who regarded the palace as his own territory, had just heard about his rival's presence. Now he appeared in the doorway, determined to drive the trespasser away. He gave Odysseus a sharp kick in the ribs and shouted at him, so that the whole hall could hear. "Get out here, old man, or I'll kick you out. This is my patch. I've been begging here for years, and I'm treated like one of the family. I've got just as much of right to be here as you do," replied Odysseus. "Besides, there's plenty to go around. But I warn you, don't be deceived by my appearance. I fought and beaten many better men than you in my long life." The suitors laughed gleefully at the sight of the two beggars challenging each other to a fight. Now they would have some fun. They led them out the courtyard and formed a large circle around them. Then they stripped off their rags. When Iris saw his opponent's muscular body, he stepped back trembling. But it was too late to back down. The fight didn't last long. Within seconds, he lay in the dust with blood streaming out of his nose. The suitors left him propped up, semi-conscious, against the courtyard wall, and carried Odysseus back into the hall on their shoulders, in mock triumph. Then they drank to him as a champion. "This must be a god among beggars," sneered Eumachius. "See how the light shines on his bald head? What a pity he's allowed himself to degenerate into a cringing parasite. If he was willing to use those limbs to work instead of beg, I'd pay him well. As it is, the only thing about him that really works is his fat belly." "Eumachius," replied the beggar king, "you're the parasite, so bloated with conceit that you find it easier to insult others than exert yourself. I beg because I have to, and if I had the chance to swing the scythe or push a plow, then you'd see what you can do. But it's clear that your brain, like your smooth white hands, has never been properly used. You and Antonius think you're great lords because of all the other dogs fawn at your heels. But I warn you, Eumachius, when the lion returns to his lair, you'll die like a dog with the rest of us. You'll run yelping from Odysseus' vengeance, and there'll be nowhere to hide." "Insolent old fool," sneered Eumachius. "You must be drunk or crazy to speak like that. Antonius clearly had the right idea. Here's some more of his medicine." The stool was aimed straight at Odysseus' head, but he ducked beneath it, and it crashed into the wine-bearer standing behind him. The wine-bearer buckled at the knees, dropping his jars. The blood-red wine splashed across the marble floor. Then there was an uproar in the hall. "This wretched old beggar has brought nothing but trouble," said the suitor, raising his voice above the general commotion. "If he stays here any longer, we'll be at each other's throats," said another. "Let's throw him out before it's too late." "Then you'll have to throw me out too," said Telemachus, placing himself in front of his own disguised father. "It seems to me that it's all of you who have had too much to drink, not this poor old man. I suggest you go and sleep it off. After all, tomorrow is Apollo's feast day, and I'm sure you'll need a good night's sleep to get back to your appetites." The suitors were astonished to hear the young prince speak to them so sternly, but they were not inclined to argue. For the first time in over 3 years they felt unsure of their ground. It had been a very disturbing day.